Hello everyone. First of all, I'm just so sorry not to be with you today. While my COVID symptoms are quite mild, I'm not quite well enough to travel and to be in a conference for a whole day. I was really looking forward to seeing colleagues and friends in person and to be reflecting and learning with everyone. The lineup of abstracts looks just fantastic. The range of themes is really exciting. And all this just adds to my prevailing fear of missing out. For those of you who know me, know this is a common affliction and can often get me into trouble. I'm very grateful to Tim and the Sociological committee for this warm invitation. It's a privilege to be part of an academic organisation, our learning community, that is collegial, encouraging, supportive, and has been inspiring for me. I'm delighted that teaching is the focus of this year's Response Day and honoured to be part of the programme. Thank you for making it happen, even if I'm not physically there. In the time we have, I want to reflect on Bell Hooks's work, a thinker and activist whose pedagogy has been foundational to my approach and probably has been to many of you in this room, to your learning and to your teaching. I'll first introduce Hooks's notion of a learning community, but I'll do that quite briefly. I imagine this will have been cited extensively throughout the day. I'll suggest some of the ways it's helped develop my teaching, as well as drawing out some of the challenges that I face putting it into practice. In particular, I'm going to reflect on what it means to disrupt the student-teacher hierarchy by releasing authority, by trying to diversify voices in a classroom, and to thinking about what it means to take risks for Hook, strategies which she embraces. And then I'll hand over to Tim, who's kindly going to facilitate the discussion and the more interactive part of today. I first read Bell Hooks's critical pedagogies about 10 years ago, not long after I started at Chester. Sorry, just a second. I was a newly minted postdoc in a new position, and having produced a piece of qualitative work for my doctorate that intentionally inhabited what Maynard and Purvis call the parameters of feminist research, I was trying to translate that into the classroom. I didn't really know where to start. I didn't know what a feminist pedagogy might look like or feel like, or how it might shape my courses, lectures, and learning activities. In Teaching to Transgress and Teaching Community, Hooks articulates a vision of building a learning community. She's drawing on Ferreira's work and his critique of educators who were hostile and suspicious of active student participation. Writing in the context of teaching literacy to Brazilian adults, Ferreira suggests that dominant models of learning and teaching are based on a banking concept of education. This analogy reveals a hierarchical power between teacher and student, in which the teacher dominates by depositing information into students, who passively accept the knowledge delivered. Students are containers to be filled as the teacher issues directives to receive, memorize, and repeat. Or teaching is understood as an exercise of pouring information into a learner. Freire famously rejects this banking notion, arguing it dehumanizes and oppresses both student and teacher, hindering learning by diminishing the opportunity to question, inquire, and challenge. In contrast to this banking notion, for Hooks, a learning community empowers and transforms students by using practices of freedom. These are based on holistic and democratic principles that contravene the damaging and violent boundaries of difference, such as gender, race, and class, and disrupts the hierarchy of power between teacher and student. Hooks identifies types of practices that engender community through student-centered and collaborative learning, empowering students' experiences and acknowledging diversity. Taking community seriously means fostering networks and connections between all members of the course. Creating democratic learning spaces, as Hooks describes, means releasing my authority. Unsurprisingly, I find this a very challenging aspect of building a learning community. We know it can be difficult for students to challenge the lecturer's voice, which is institutionally sanctioned by management, assessment, and discipline. As Hooks observes, the notion that lecturers can and should be dictators is ingrained in students' perceptions. As Judith Perumal's ethnography of teaching highlights, students can also collude to maintain instructors' power. And she says, as schools and universities are knowledge producing, knowledge credentializing agencies, and these are functions that their teachers need to fulfill. One approach for upsetting this authority is decreasing interaction. For Hooks, this is embodied. She advocates leaving the safety of the lectern or the desk, a barrier that separates the teacher from the students and is a symbol of control, authority, and power. She says she wants to walk in and with her students, which of course is difficult online for sure. She says this disrupts the notion of the professor as an omnipotent, all-knowing mind. As you physically become part of the learning space, you physically become part of the learning body. Another strategy that she says might disrupt this interaction and increase interaction, disrupt the hierarchy, is to ask students to write paragraphs during class at various stages through the lecture, which they then read to one another. And I try and do this. Rather than me set questions for seminar readings, students work in small groups to set questions for each other. I sometimes leave the room or the Teams meeting at the start of these activities to give students the space. And when I come back, they're usually in full flow and don't notice me. And I'm sort of struck by her notion of being embodied in the classroom, but sometimes how leaving the classroom might engender a space in which that hierarchy is disrupted, and there's more opportunities for students to interact, for their voices to be centred. When I do come back in, and like I said, they're usually in full flow, they don't really notice me, I try and hold back from eavesdropping too carefully, or correcting too much, or praising them too much. And I try, because I don't want to interfere unless they ask me. But I'm still walking in the class, I'm still part of the student body. These strategies are usually offer a really welcome change of pace in a lecture setting, but they are more than just a break from teacher talking time, or for student, or then they're more than just an opportunity for students to discuss the material, to think of a couple of questions. These sorts of strategies that Hooks advocate relocate authority from my summaries, my questions, and my presentations, so that for Hooks, our voice, my voice, is not the only account of what happens in the classroom. This counters then how students have been, as Hooks says, trained to view themselves as not the one in authority, not the ones with legitimacy, which is a key feature of a learning community. In her critique of the whiteness of the academy, feminist essentialism in the classroom, she offers a particularly brilliant and devastating reading of Diana Fous's work, for example. And alongside her call to decolonise, destabilising authority is also central. She reminds readers, let's face it, most of us were taught in classrooms where styles of teaching reflected the notion of a single norm of thought, of experience, which we were encouraged to believe was universal. And of course, premised on white, male, heteronormative, Eurocentric experiences. Hooks is mindful of the language of voice, and suggests students' engagement and participation can happen in less literally voiced ways. She talks about looking for signs of participation, but she's not particular about what that means. But she still insists that while some of her students resent making a verbal contribution, for her it's a requirement, because it's one way that a diversity of voices and experiences are heard and listened to. There are some spaces in which it seems harder to decolonise and upset the notion of a single norm of thought to include a range of voices, such as in a research seminar where staff and postgraduate students are taking part, usually by listening to an invited expert speaker. For postgraduate students of colour, women from working class background, students from working class backgrounds, students with disabilities, students not working in their first language, this is an inhospitable space, or it can be. I think each of us here could probably recall incidents in research events where some have been silenced, we may have been silenced ourselves, and we will have been complicit in silencing others. I think hooks can help us here too. Those of you who've given papers in TRS Chester might be familiar with our research seminar practices, which we have developed deliberately to intentionally try to build a learning community that empowers, transforms, and enables space for participation for all. During the seminars, for example, after a speaker has concluded her paper, audience members are asked to spend 5 minutes sharing their thoughts just with each other in very small groups, maybe just 2 or 3. This gives the speaker a short break before the discussion, and it offers a more private space for members of the audience to have some initial reflections. It lets participants rehearse their comments or questions, and there's an editing process that happens here so that members of the same group can make sure that comments and questions are constructive, not combative. And it's an opportunity for staff and students to actually meet and talk to each other, often members of staff that aren't working with particular students. So it enhances that sense of belonging. During the question and answer segment, it's students that are invited to feedback their comments and observations first. And we often ask them to just share their reflections and observations. We're not looking for some critical dynamite question that's going to take apart the speaker's presentation. But we make sure that whatever happens, it happens before staff members get a chance to wade in. So this prevents staff from dominating the conversation and gives students access to the speaker. We're trying to create a sense of belonging by weakening the barriers to participation for all members of the community, but particularly our graduate students. For hooks, building a learning community also involves risk. When risk is sometimes discussed in the pedagogical literature, the focus is on minimising risk for students so they feel confident. Exley and Denick make this point. But for hooks, it is a key part of the learning community, but she also urges teachers, lecturers to take risks that undermine authority by, for example, allowing students to see us thinking aloud, for increasing interaction through open dialogue, by establishing curiosity and inquiry as the norm. And she talks about liaising between student and topic rather than acting as that source of knowledge that we discussed earlier. I don't know about you, but I find it quite difficult to give up being a source of knowledge, and it feels very risky to be uncertain, to think out loud, to be unsure, to not know. Particularly at the start of my career, and also even now when I'm teaching a new area. When I'm asked a question I'm not sure of, I can feel my hesitancy to admitting that I don't know bubbling up. The student is taking a risk in asking a question, and I'm not always prepared to do the same. And as Hooks comments, empowerment cannot happen if we refuse to be vulnerable while encouraging students to take risk. I do promise myself regularly that this time when I'm asked a question and I don't know the answer, I'm just going to say, I don't know. I still find it difficult to do that. And I've noticed that I've developed strategies that on reflection are designed to deflect. The student asking the question is sometimes set the task of finding the answer out for next week rather than me admitting that I don't know. Or I say something like, oh, that's a really interesting question. What does everyone else think? Or I start to answer the question, realise I'm not sure where I'm going, so I just keep talking, and I keep talking, and I keep talking. And then I end up on a different topic entirely, ending with a very vague sort of, okay, you've got that, that's clear, does that make sense? Yeah, great, brilliant, we'll move on. One time, admittedly, and it was when I just started teaching, a student asked a question just before the break. I stalled by saying, great, that's fantastic, but I'm just on a break and I'll answer that in 10 minutes. I nip back to my office and double check the answer out on Wikipedia. My risk aversion can mean I hang on to my typical teacher as a single authority model that I want to actually disrupt. I've noticed this occurs when I'm less confident, when I'm tired, when I've got COVID, when I'm feeling underprepared or worried about covering all of the content. And these are factors that Pippin suggests feed into the way in which we're reluctant to take risks. There are also times when jargon slips in as I try to cover up what I don't know, or I'll turn the question round to something I do know about and end up giving what Brookfield and Preskill can call an impromptu lecturette, which dominates. And as a result, students have less time to discuss the topic at hand for themselves, to explore, to think and to learn. Hooks, of course, would rather I admit my uncertainty. It's the risk she would say is necessary for me to take to unsettle the boundaries between teacher and student, to maximise student input that is core to a learning community. Perhaps there are other ways, though, for me to interpret or reinterpret this risk that can contribute to the learning community. I've been thinking about this, and I wondered whether the next time it happens, I could use it as a chance to model how I do find things out that I need to know, and to demonstrate the research process in action in class while I'm trying to find out the answer to their question. This might just mean simply searching the library catalogue for a relevant article, checking an online encyclopedia or an online or library-based academic reference book. And yes, maybe looking at Wikipedia and its entry, and then encouraging the class to think through whether it's a reliable account, bringing those critical skills that we often that are badly needed for looking at online material. These are strategies I think Hooks might approve of, because I become part of the learning community as we learn together. I remember being struck, and I still am, by Hooks's joy and defence for teaching, as she says, as a subject worthy of our regard. Her passionate decolonising of the classroom to make it into, she says, a radical space of possibility. This seems even more pressing in a context where teaching has become part of a neoliberal project in which the classroom can be a platform for, as again Hooks would say, opportunistic concerns. It's also Hooks's personal, invested, implicated, or as she would say, engaged pedagogy that builds a learning community that has stayed with me. Central to this, for her, is teaching that she says respects and cares of the souls of our students. I've always thought this statement a little terrifying. I'm not sure I am a worthy caretaker for my students' souls, and I'm not entirely sure I should be. But I don't need to be a caretaker of my students' souls to recognise that a learning community is a commitment for Hooks to the holistic well-being of students and teachers. So thank you for listening. It's now over to you. I realise I'm not actually modelling one of my own strategies here, because rather than letting you generate questions, I have set some for you, but you are totally welcome to ditch them or to adapt them in any way you see fit that makes this a learning and reflective experience for you. But I am going to hand over to Tim, and yes, just once again, thanks very much for the opportunity, and hope to see you all really soon. Thanks.